One of the challenges that we have is that we really don't have a good picture of ourselves. We think we do, but we really don't. You've seen the hockey coach whose kid is on the team, and his kid is not as good as he thinks that he is, but his kid gets to play 2/3 of the time because he thinks his kid's better, right? We've all seen that happen. Because people that we love and ourselves, we love ourselves, we really don't have a very good picture of ourselves. On the radio not too long ago, I heard some interesting statistics. 94% of people consider themselves above average in honesty. If your math's not real good, average is 50. So 94% of people think that they are above average in honesty. 44% of people have no idea where they're at with honesty. 89% of people believe they have above average common sense. That one's wrong for sure. 85% of people consider themselves above average intelligence. I taught school for 51 years, that was not right either. Some of you may be acquainted with the Scottish poet Robert Burns. My father is McMillan, came from Scotland. My father didn't, but my grandfather and great-grandfather did. And my father was born on January 25th, which was Robert Burns' birthday. I was always very special to my father. I'm sure he had no idea of the immoralities that Robert Burns had in his life, but it was always very special. But he has written some amazing stuff. And one of the lines from one of his poems says, "Oh, that the Almighty had given us the ability to see ourselves as others see us." And I want to try to help you this morning to have a look at yourself. It doesn't do me any good to tell you what you're like. You need to listen and read and study and talk to God, and you need to look inside and see, maybe I'm not as much that way as I thought that I was. And so that's what I want to try to do with you this morning. I taught in public school for several years, taught Christian school, administered both of those, and then I retired, and I really missed teaching. And all of a sudden this ad came in the paper to teach adult education at Southeast College. And it was people who had dropped out of high school somewhere along the way, pregnancy, drugs, whatever got in their way, and then wanted to go back and get the grade 12. We graduated a 53-year-old, a couple of 51-year-olds, several 40-year-olds. What a thrill. It was just absolutely amazing. And teaching. So quite often people would ask me, what's the difference between teaching high school kids and adults? I said, the main difference is that junior high and high school kids, I spent a lot of my time trying to convince them that they didn't know near as much as they thought they knew, and that they needed me. With adult education, I spent most of my time trying to convince them that they actually were way better than what they thought they were, and were a lot smarter than they thought they were, and a lot more capable, and sitting in the classroom is not the only way to get an education and learn and mature and grow. But each of them didn't have a very good idea of what they were really like. And I would propose to you that most Christians don't really have a very good idea of what they're like. And you need help from other people. That's why we do this in body. That's why we do it together, so that people can help you to be a better person, and to be more godly, and to be more humble, to be more all of the things that we're supposed to do. Culture is one of those things that people very often misjudge. Culture is so powerful on us. I have a friend who's president of a Bible college, and he has a little saying. He says, usually culture trumps Bible. If you played cards a little bit, you got trump cards. Culture usually trumps the Bible. And I could give you dozens of illustrations of it happening in every church that I know, where culture trumps Bible. But I want to try and encourage you that Bible trumps culture. Let's try to keep the Bible. And so as we go through this today, it's not what John's saying. I want you to go back and read that and get the picture there of the Bible and what it's about. But the two hardest things that I think we have to do as Christians is to figure out their culture, because that's 2,000 years ago and several thousand miles away. And so what on earth is Peter writing to them about? Well, I tried to give you some idea of that last week, that this is the Roman Empire, very cruel government. If you haven't read anything about Roman empires, they ruled totally by fear. There's historical records of a kilometer outside of Jerusalem of Jewish people crucified along the side of the road just to show people we are in charge and we're the boss and don't you step out of line. Jesus was by far not the only one who got crucified. There's thousands and thousands of people crucified. Can you imagine a kilometer long of crosses one after the other of people just to enforce fear? When people talk about our government today and make any kind of comparison to that, I think, do you know anything about history at all? And so I want to encourage you to think about what Peter's culture was like. That's the hard part, one of the hard parts. But it's even harder to move Peter's teaching to our culture where we're at. And what exactly does this mean for us? And how do we do this anyway? But that's what we have to do. And it's not all black and white. And it's not all so definite as some people like to make it out to be. And there are lots of things that we need to do, but there are some things that are pretty clear, and that's what I want to focus on today is, what does Peter tell them that I think is pretty clear, and I hope I can convince you that this is the clear part. So 1 Peter, I told you last week, should be all one letter. If we could just throw away all the chapters and verses, how much better that it would be. But if you had it all in one letter, then it is written very well. If you were an English teacher, which I was, then the first part, chapter 1, verse 1, down to 2, verse 10, would be the kind of introduction and the theological basis. And Peter goes through what we talked about last week, be holy as I'm holy. In chapter 2, we are living stones, we are a royal priesthood, we are very special, we are a chosen people, all that kind of theological basis. And in English class, we would draw a diagram. If you're writing a story or a novel, there's always an introduction and a building of things. And then you get to the climax of the story, and then there's the ending, the closing, denouement, they call it in English class, if you want to really be scholarly. And that's the diagram. In 1 Peter, up to 2 verse 10 is the climbing a hill, and the climax is what was read to us from verse 11 and 12. This is the core message. This is what Peter really wants them to get. And that's what I want to encourage you this morning is, this is what you are really to get. If you boil it right down to the Reader's Digest version, this is what you're going to get. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, we talked about that last week, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. And then we immediately go to our list. Sinful desires, no dance, no drugs, no dope, no alcohol, no. And people all have their list of sinful desires. I want to encourage you that Peter is going to tell you what the sinful desires are. It's not the list that you might have in your head. of what's so terrible and awful. He's going to go through and talk to him. It's one of the things with the Bible writings, especially the good writers like Paul and Peter. They will tell you what you're supposed to do, and then they will tell you what they mean by that. And that's what the rest of Peter is about. From chapter 2:13 to the end is then the how you go about doing verse 11 and 12. Right? So if you're still with me, 11 and 12 would be the TSN turning point. 2:13 to the end of chapter 5 would be the practical, this is how we live, this is how we do it. Okay? So, the very core message, 2 verse 11 and 12, he reminds them that they're aliens and strangers in the world. Why is it that we have such a time with being aliens and strangers? That's what Peter says Christians are. That's what Peter is telling you. That's what I'm suggesting, reminding, encouraging you is you are an alien and a stranger and you don't fit here. Quit trying to fit. You don't fit here. You're an alien and a stranger and a pilgrim just passing through here. Don't think that everybody's going to love you. Don't think that the government's going to make everything wonderful for you. Don't think that you're going to fit here because you're an alien and a stranger here. You're passing through. You're different. So I want to encourage you to remind yourself of that. Abstain from sinful desires. And he's going to go on to talk about what those are. Especially this line I love. Live such good lives among the pagans and unbelievers that they can see your good works and they will, as the translation read said, believe, and they will glorify God. So I want to encourage you to think about, am I living such a good life that people give glory to God? Do people say about me, that is a beautiful person that I would want to be like? That's what he's telling them. Live such a good life that people will look at you, even the pagans, even these mean Romans, even the people who have never opened the Bible, even people who say they don't believe anything at all, will say, I don't believe in what they believe in, but I like how they live. That's what it's all about. I want to encourage you that that's the core of Peter's message, but then he doesn't leave you lost with how to do that. He carries on with how to do that. And Peter isn't the only one, of course. Jesus says that in Matthew 5, verse 16. Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. So it's not just Peter. Peter's got it from Jesus. But Peter then goes on to talk about what does that look like? How do we put clothes on this skeleton? What does that actually mean? And I would suggest to you, and this is going to be the rest of this sermon next week and the week after, Peter says there's at least 3 things that you do. One is that you live in submission. 2 is that you enjoy and live and rejoice in suffering, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. And then that you live godly lives, and that's what we're going to close off with in the last lesson. So I want to have you think about today submission. Submission is one of those words that we Canadians just do not like. In English class, we talk about denotation and connotation. Denotation means what the dictionary says the meaning of the word is. That's the same for everybody. Connotation means the feelings that you get, the emotions that rise up in you when you hear that. So when I was teaching adult education, most of them had had a terrible time, terrible experience in school. They'd been bullied in school, they had been picked on in school, they'd been, teacher had said something terrible to them, they had failed too much stuff and convinced themselves they were no good. So when you said school to them, they just immediately got stiff. And that's the connotation. If you look up school in the dictionary, it would say something like a place where you learn and do arithmetic and reading and whatever. I don't even know what the dictionary says, but that would be the same for everybody. But the connotation is not. Canadians, in general, have a very negative connotation when we talk about submission, because that's not our way, right? Our way is to conquer and beat everybody else up. Our way is to get more money than the other guy so we can overpower them. Our way is we will go to university and we'll get more education and more training so we can then be in control. We like the opposite of submission. That's just in our culture, and culture trumps Bible. And Canadians in churches have unfortunately gone with culture that it's better to beat people up. And that's why we end up hurting other people. As we beat them up with words, we beat them up with something else. We outvote them, we overpower them, we coalition, we get more people on our side so that we can overpower the other rather than submitting. So I want you to stretch yourself this morning. I want you to really seriously beg you to think about, am I just run by culture, or am I really a submissive kind of person? Someday you're going to be parallel up here, horizontal with the floor, in a box about the size of this thing. People are going to talk about you. Will they say, this was a very submissive person? The Greek word for submission means to order oneself under. The context or the kind of full picture of it is, if you place yourself under the social order of the day, that might change depending on the social order of the day. That might be very different in Canada than it is in Saudi Arabia. But submission still means, whatever situation you're in, that you are placing yourself under others. The posture is that you are seeking the welfare of others, even the entire society, over one's own well-being. Got that? Seeking the welfare of others, even the entire society, over one's own well-being. That's not Canadian culture, is it? Remember, the goal is to win unbelievers. The goal is not to amass more money. The goal is not to have more position. The goal is not to have more power and control. The goal is not to get ahead of the Joneses. The goal is for other people to look at you and say, I want what they've got. If that's your goal, then there are ways to go about that. So then he's still not done. He just keeps it going through here, and he gives you guidelines as to how to go about that. First off, he talks about government. Verse 2, chapter 2, 13 to 17, citizens submitting to government. You say, well, that they don't know our government. You don't know the Roman government. He's talking about these people submitting to the Roman government who ruled the way I just described to you a little bit ago. I want to ask you, if people looked at you, would they say, that person is very, very submissive to the government? I want to be like that. See, submission is such a beautiful picture. I was having a little visit with Caitlin yesterday, and I'm going to be the pastor, and she's going to be doing a lot of stuff with and for me. And I was reminded of administrative assistants that I've had. A couple of them were sure they knew way more than me. Man, it was hard working with them. But I had a Cindy and a Jennifer. Man, they were submissive. Whatever I wanted done, they would do. Not only were they very capable, but whatever I wanted, they placed themselves under me, and they willingly did what I wanted them to do because I was the president and they were the administrative assistant. Because their job was to place themselves in submission. But Peter broadens it way broader than that all of us are to be submissive kind of people, certainly to government. Secondly, he talks about slaves. We say, oh, that's awful. Slavery is just such an awful, awful thing. And of course it is. But in their day, that's what they had. Was masters and slaves. And he said, if you're ever going to impress your master to be a believer, to be a Christian, then you need to be a submissive slave. Today, it's employers and employees. If you're ever going to convince your employer, and that's your job, from the climax, chapter 2, verse 12, your job is to be such an influence on the employer that they say, I want to be like that. And if you're going to do that, you need to be a submissive employee. You might be able to be president of the union and still do that, but it would be pretty difficult. And I want to encourage you to think about, if you're an employee, what do I need to be like to be a submissive kind of employee? Then he moves to the famous verses that has caused a lot of the female gender troubles. Chapter 3, 1-6, wives submitting to their husbands. And he specifically says in those few verses, if you are that kind of person, your husband could be converted, could become a believer without you saying one word, because they will be so impressed with your submissive life. And then he moves to chapter 3, verse 7, and this is where it gets to stretch, and I want to encourage you to make the jump with me. In chapter 3, verse 7, you can look there if you really don't believe me and need it. He says, in the same way. And he's said that a couple times already. He's come through government and employees and wives. In chapter 3, verse 1, when he's talking about wives, he says, in the same way, same as government and the same as masters and slaves, wives. And then verse 7, he says, in the same way, husbands. He doesn't use the word submit, but that's what he means. Husbands, submit to your wives. Live considerately with them. This is not just a wife thing. This is a husband thing. And then he moves to 3, verse 8, and he says again, all of you submit to one another. I want to encourage you to think about again, when you're in this box and you're done making your impression, Is the person that's up here talking about you going to say, this was a very submissive kind of person? Is that the way that you lived your life? That it was so submissive that other people said, wow, I want to be like that. Christians submitting to the hostile culture made it so that other people were so impressed. I told you the first transition pastoring job that I did was with a little Mennonite church in Treesbank, just south of Brandon. It's a little evangelical Mennonite, EMC Mennonite church. Wonderful people. But the organization, they're part of the conference, and their Jerusalem was at Steinbach, and the central office decided that those of us who were trying to pastor and not Mennonites needed a little Mennonite education. So they sent us to this 2-day workshop thing to learn what Mennonites were, what their real basis was. It's fair. But I was fascinated by their history from Germany when they got started. The King of Prussia had an army constantly, and when they weren't at war with France or somebody else, the king told them, just go hunt down Mennonites and massacre and kill them all. But the historical evidence and proof that happened was that the more they sacrificed and slaughtered and killed Mennonites, the more people were impressed with their submission, with their love for peace, with the way they lived, and more people became Mennonites who got converted. And finally the king said, stop, we're not going to kill anymore because it's having the opposite effect of what we wanted it to do. It's making more of them instead of less. And they stopped persecuting them for that period of time. Isn't that amazing? That's because they learned submission. That's because they could live in such a way that unbelievers looked at them and said, I want to be like that. And I want to ask you, are the unbelievers around you looking at you and saying, I want to be like that? And I want to encourage you that there are lots of issues in our world today. This is where the ice gets a little bit thinner. But how you're handling masking and COVID, is that causing unbelievers to say, I'm not saying what you should be doing, but whichever way that you're doing it, is it causing unbelievers to say, I want to be like that? Are you handling it in a submissive way? Or are you aggressive, and defiant, and disrespectful, and rebellious? I'm not telling you which way you need to be, but I am telling you. Peter tells you, you need to be submissive. You need to be living such a way that other people say, I want to be like that. Whichever way you've decided to be, that's what you need to be doing. That's the clear part. It's not so clear with lots of issues. Not so clear. But it is clear you need to be a submissive kind of person. So sometimes black and white is not always there. There's lots of gray things. Rules are easy to lay out for us. We can find them in the Bible. We can find them in our Constitution. We can find rules lots of places. But the application in reality is often very messy and complicated. I remember one time when I was young, and I went to a Christian school, and we were in Bible class, and I decided I'm going to get divorce and remarriage and all of that stuff figured out, and I will know what this is about so I can preach and tell people this is what you need to be doing. And I read and studied, and finally my Bible teacher said, his name was Max Maurer, a wonderful man, had a huge impact on my life. And he said, John, sometimes you just can't unscramble eggs. It's because life gets very messy. The rules are easy to read, but the application of it can be very messy with bunches and bunches of issues. But whatever the issues, you are to live in a submissive life that causes other people to say, I want to be like that. So we live between the two visions. We have a huge paradox of grace and truth Jesus has given to us. In John chapter 1, 16 and 17 says, Jesus was full of truth. That's the rules, the right, this is how things are supposed to be. But he was also full of grace. And that's hugely complicated for us to copy, to put that all together. But that's our job. We persist as faithfully as we can, and we try to navigate through all of the scrambled eggs. But we understand that the wheat and the tares shows us the world is mixed, and we have to coexist in the middle of that somehow. And so we try to sort through best that we can. We have motives, others have motives. Sometimes those motives are downright sin. Sometimes they're graft, sometimes they're ambivalence, sometimes they're compromise, sometimes they are partial truths, and sometimes we have to admit we've just lived a whole lie. We cannot hold out for all or nothing results. So whatever you feel like in the rules and the issues of the day that come along, I want to encourage you, you can't decide this is absolutely the way that this has to be. And there are hundreds of issues and discussions like that. I told you last week when we were having communion, I grew up in a church and I had learned to love weekly communion. What if I came to you and said, I'd like to be a pastor, but we must have weekly communion. If you don't, I'm not going to come. Not going to be here. There are hundreds of things like that that we could draw the line on and be in rules. And I want to encourage you, it's not all or nothing. There's a whole lot of scrambled eggs, and there's a whole lot of sorting that we have to do. We do the sorting in submission to one another, not bossing each other, and not hurting each other, and not controlling, and not overpowering, and not coalitioning everybody else. We do that in submission. So I want to ask you, as you've had pastors serve you, have you lived in submission? If you've been a pastor, have you pastored in submission? As you've elected and followed leadership team, have you lived in submission? And if you've been on the leadership team, have you lived in submission to the congregation? So I want to encourage you. Peter says, the way to live so that other people want to live like you is to live in submission. Next week we're going to talk about suffering. That's not any easier. We're going to talk about godly living. And so in summary, one of the terms that we've developed from computer things is a default. I'm really handicapped technologically, but I have learned that computers have a default. That's what they go back to when everything else doesn't work. And people all have a default. When Christians have a default, we go back to what we are comfortable with or used to, or our culture. We default back to that. I want to encourage you to go to defaults, and I think the Bible gives us defaults along the way. There's lots and lots of chapters and verses and lots of stuff in the Bible, but there are some things that I think are default. Matthew 22, Jesus says, love God, love others. I have this friend, he says, that's the only two things God's going to ask you at Judgment Day. Did you love God? Did you love others? If you can check the box honestly, in you go. I want to encourage you that that's a default. But really that's submission, isn't it? If you love God, you will submit to God. If you love others, you will submit to others. It doesn't mean that you will allow abuse. Obviously there's spousal abuse and there's employee abuse. It doesn't mean that. That's part of the scrambled eggs and figuring that all out in there. But it does mean if you love God, love others. That's kind of a default position. I think Matthew 28:18-20, the Great Commission. And Jesus tells them to go and make disciples, which is really what Peter's telling them. And I think that 1 Peter 2:11-12 is a default position. That's where you need to go to. Every day when you get up, what am I going to do today that will be so submissive, that will be so accepting of suffering for next week, that will cause other people to say, I want to be like that. I think that's a default position. I'm guessing that that's probably a little overwhelming for you. And I'm guessing you're saying, oh my goodness, where do I start? And instead of being overwhelmed with it, I want to encourage you to pick out one. Maybe I'm just going to start with being submissive to God. Maybe I'm going to start with being submissive to government. Maybe I'm going to start with being submissive to whatever. Pick out one thing and work on it this week. Add another one next week. Over the next year, let's really work. I'm going to be here hounding you for a year. Let's work on a year from now. We are a submissive people submitting to each other. That's what God wants from us. Man, it's hard. Let's ask for help. Oh, God. I just want to thank you for this wonderful group of people that love you so much. And I want to be submissive to them. And I want them to be submissive to each other like you want them to be. So that everybody around us that sees us in the store, on the hockey ice, on the farm, when we're buying a truck, when we're doing everything that we do, that people will see us and say, man, they got something I don't have and I want to be like that. And that's so hard, God, because it gets complicated and it hurts. Sometimes we suffer because of that. Sometimes we're poor because of that. Sometimes we get taken advantage of because of that. We recognize that your son got taken advantage of. And we just want to be like him. In his name.